Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's episode of Caserta's Data Intelligence webinar series. I'm your host, Remy Rosenbaum. Today, we're going to explore the topic of applying asset management principles and practices to information. Now, if we all agree that data is such an important asset, then how come more than half of organizations admit they have a better inventory of their office furniture than of their data? And now, decades into the information age, there is no excuse for not managing your information assets with at least the same or better discipline than the way you manage other business assets. Of course, the value of data is nowhere to be found on any balance sheet, but leading organizations ignore that accounting vagary and, regardless, still treat data like an asset. In today's episode, we have the father of Infonomics, Doug Laney, who has recently joined Caserta as Principal Data Strategy, to teach you how to apply classic asset management principles and practices to maximize your data's value. Doug was formerly a vice president and distinguished analyst with Gartner's Chief Data Officer Advisory Team and co-founder of the Deloitte Analytics Institute. He is a best-selling author and a recognized authority on data and analytics strategy. Doug's book, Infonomics, How to Monetize, Manage, and Measure Information for Competitive Advantage, was selected by CIO Magazine as the must-read book of the year. Caserta's complimentary data analytics expert webinar series is designed to give you insight into today's hottest technological trends and issues. After the webinar, I encourage you to speak with us about any questions on how to apply what you have learned today at your organization. Our initial consultations are always free, and if we find an opportunity to work together, then we can discuss the next steps. And if not, we will gladly point you in the right direction. After today's webinar, we'll send you a recording to the email address that you provided. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the questions panel on the right, and we'll answer them during the live Q&A session at the conclusion of the webinar. Doug, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Remy, and hi, everyone, and good afternoon from Chicago. Glad you all could join us. So the road to truly appreciating information as an asset was paved for me by a dreadful, despicable act, the 9/11 terror attacks on the United States. In addition to the horrific loss of life and the destruction of buildings, we later learned that something else was destroyed, the data of several businesses. And back in 2001, cloud technology and offsite backups were not nearly as prevalent as they are today. So in fact, some of these companies actually lost their data. Now, naturally, what you do when you suffer some kind of loss is contact your insurance company and submit a claim for the loss. And what happened was, as we learned, that the insurance companies denied the claims for the value of the data that was lost, and a number of court cases ensued in which companies sued for the loss of their data, sued the insurance companies, and it was a bit of a mess for some organizations. Now, what the insurance industry did, recognizing that they were a bit exposed, was update the commercial general liability policy standard template that specifies what is covered by insurance policies. And they updated it to explicitly exclude electronic data from P&C policies. When did they do that? Barely a month after 9/11, to add insult to injury. Now, the accounting profession followed suit a couple of years later and said, listen, if the insurance industry isn't going to recognize information as an asset, then we're not going to recognize as property, then we're not going to recognize it as an asset. And they updated a key financial standard to make that standard policy. And even today, the courts still remain confused as to whether information is an asset or not, or should be considered property. Some of the courts have issued rulings along the lines of, well, since information can be represented by bubbles on an optical disc or printed, made physical, that it should be considered property, and property law should apply. Other courts have issued kind of funny rulings like, well, since electrons have negligible mass, information shouldn't be considered an asset. So that's the kind of crazy world we live in today. And even the governments have gotten involved in assessing whether we should be updating a 1930s style accounting system to actually recognize information as an asset. But since those hearings, nothing really has happened. So what I'm going to cover is a little bit about the book on Infonomics. So as I started to dig into this topic, it occurred to me that I really needed to put pen to paper on it and research it further. So the culmination of that work was the Infonomics book. But we're only going to cover part of it in this session and probably discuss other aspects of Infonomics in later events. So first, let's talk about defining information. One of the challenges that we have is how we use language within the data profession. A lot of people run around, spouting about, no pun intended, that information is the new oil. It's hard to go a day or a week without hearing somebody actually mention this, but it sort of misses the point that information has these unique economic characteristics that make it quite different and potentially more valuable than any kind of physical asset like oil or even financial assets like cash. Information is what economists would call a non-rivalrous, non-depleting, and even regenerative asset. That is, it's an asset that can be used simultaneously by multiple people or processes. And when you do use it, when you do consume it, it doesn't get depleted. You can consume it again and again, as long as it's still relevant. And it's somewhat regenerative in that any time that we're using information, we're typically in a position to be able to capture more information about where and when it's used. So these may seem somewhat obvious, but unfortunately what we see is that they're not baked into enterprise data strategies or data architectures as well as they should be. Of course, there are other great economic benefits for information around its inventory carrying costs, and it's cheap to transport and so forth, and of course you can see there that it's impossible to clean up if you spill it, unlike oil. So this leads us to the question of whether information is actually an asset. It's a bit of an academic discussion, but I think it's important no less to kind of understand this and maybe even anticipate someday when the accounting profession might recognize information as an asset. If you look at really any definition of what an asset is, and you don't need to read all of these, an asset is something that is owned or controlled, is exchangeable for cash, and can generate probable future economic benefits. So I don't think there's really any doubt that information meets the criteria of an asset. It's just that, and I think that because we're not treating it as an asset, because the accounting profession doesn't recognize it as an asset, I think that makes it difficult for us as data professionals to make that case, or for information to rise to the level of importance in the eyes of some people compared to other kinds of assets. But one of the things we did look at was, I did this research several years ago and repeated it again. And what we found is that companies that behave in certain kinds of information savvy or data-centric ways are favored by investors. We found that companies that have chief data officers or enterprise data governance functions or data science groups have a market to book value nearly 2 times higher than the market average. And companies that are data product companies that are actually in the business of selling data or licensing data to others have a market to book value that's nearly 3 times the market average. So there's something that investors like about companies that do more with data or positioning themselves to do more with data. So there may not be even a better argument for improving one's data strategy and overall data and analytics approach than this argument here. Now, one of the challenges again is that everybody talks about data and information kind of in the same way. Everybody sort of understands what it is, but there are subtle disagreements across the organization. We find that folks at the senior levels of the organization will talk about information as being one of the organization's greatest competitive assets. Folks on the business side will talk about, or on the financial side will talk about information being a risky asset. Folks on the business side will talk about information's impact on business performance. And then we'll have the CIOs have a little bit of a different perspective on information, certainly lately. And then we often hear, kind of a lot of consultants out there talking about, we're trying to convince people that there's a difference between data and information and knowledge and wisdom. And while those arguments are interesting and perhaps academic and a great conversation to have over a beverage, we just don't find that making those distinctions has really helped advance the profession or helped advance organizations in any way. we see information or data as more of a continuum. There are things that you do to data to make it more potentially valuable and eventually becomes consumable in a particular context. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in this session. So anyway, not to disparage the world of consulting, but I think there are better discussions and better arguments to have and better ways to articulate what a data strategy should encompass. So just to give you a little thumbnail on Infonomics, we're really only going to cover the managing information part of it, but Infonomics kind of breaks down into three components. One is monetizing information. And by monetizing information, I don't mean necessarily selling data, but there are a variety of ways to generate economic benefits from information assets. And the reason we start with monetizing information is because that's really where you want to start with the end in mind. What is the outcome that you're looking for? And the outcome for any kind of data management initiative ought to be to generate improved benefits from the information assets. And there are a variety of ways to do that we will discuss. Then there's measuring information, which gets to the point of understanding what is information's potential versus actual value characteristics. How do we measure its quality characteristics? How do we measure its impact on the business? How do we measure its cost basis and so forth? So we've developed some models on how to quantify information's value for various purposes. But again, for this session, we're going to focus on managing information and what it means to apply traditional asset management principles and practices, and why we might want to do that. These three aspects of Infonomics really flow together in the following way. There's the old adage that you can't manage what you don't measure, and I think it follows that you really can't monetize what you don't manage well. And so that's how these all go together. And for a lot of companies, this tends to be a bit of a vicious cycle, because we're not measuring information, and we're not compelled to, again, because the accounting profession says it doesn't have value on the balance sheet. And because we're not compelled to measure information, we're in a poor position to be able to budget for and get the resources that we need to manage information. And if we're not managing information with the same kind of discipline as other traditional assets, then we're in a poor position to be able to generate significant enough economic benefits from it. So that's how that all goes together. So our goal is to change this vicious cycle into more of a virtuous one. But again, for the purposes of this session, we're just going to focus on the asset management aspect. All right. So one of the things that I do is I often work with companies in evaluating their or helping to develop their data strategy documents and plans and roadmaps. And this is a kind of a common occurrence. We often see in those documents the organization talk about information being one of the company's most critical assets, or wanting to manage information as an actual asset. But the reality is, sometimes what's borne out in those documents doesn't really reflect that. It doesn't really reflect the way that other assets are managed and how that can be applied to information. So I met with one company a while ago, and I was reviewing their document, and they're a utility company, and I said, well, why, I was looking through their document, and there was nothing in there even about inventorying their information. I said, well, why wouldn't you inventory your information? I mean, imagine a retailer with no inventory of what's on their store shelves, or a CFO with no chart of accounts, or an HR executive with no employee directory. That would be a kind of a ridiculous and maybe even a dismissible offense for them, but yet CIOs and even chief data officers have got on now for years without having a comprehensive inventory of their information assets. Anyway, so I mentioned this to the client, and they say, well, we really only inventory our major assets like our trucks and our transformers and our generators and so forth. And I said, well, why not apply that same kind of discipline to your information if it's really that much of a critical asset? And they said, well, yeah, maybe we should do that. And they kind of nodded gratuitously. Anyway, after the meeting, I go into the men's room, and this is what I see. Sorry for the visual, but it's impactful. They have actually inventory tagged their urinals and actually tagged atop the bathrooms as well what the ID of the restroom is. And so this is a company that claims they've inventoried their major assets like their trucks and their transformers, and oh, by the way, their toilets, but not their information. And unfortunately, this is the state of affairs in a lot of companies, where we find more than half of them have a better inventory of things like their office furniture or other kinds of devices than they do their data assets. And I think that's a particular challenge. If you don't know what you have, then you're really in a poor position to manage it or monetize it. All right, so let's get to managing information as an asset and some of the principles there. You know, in short, our profession has been beckoning for an infusion of new ideas to improve data strategy. Humans have been managing a variety of types of assets and resources for centuries and millennia. And in fact, generation after generation, we've gotten quite good at developing and honing methods for doing so. But again, we data professionals have kind of done a poor job of recognizing these practices, understanding their applicability to the way that we manage information, and adapting them for our needs. So exploring the wide variety of specific asset management activities that exist for each of the traditional asset classes, we can understand and begin to apply these principles to our information assets as well. So let's explore some of them. So first we have physical asset management, and you know, making the distinction between raw materials and unfinished goods and finished goods, and the way brick and mortar businesses do this gives us a framework perhaps for thinking about and managing raw, cleansed, and integrated data, or if you want to call it data versus information versus whatever. So already we've seen where storage and distribution of information have taken a page out of the materials management handbook. Remember, we call it a data warehouse. You know, the data warehouse concept is a perfect example. So what else is there to learn? What other epiphanies would we have about effectively storing and handling and transporting information if we actually spent a day at the loading dock, for example? I think plenty. For example, a critical and highly topical issue of material asset management cost savings revolves around maintenance. To what degree should we expend upfront costs for planned information maintenance or cleansing versus more costly unplanned maintenance downstream? You know, our metadata managers and data administrators too could learn a lot from the way that we standardize you know, things throughout the organization, and perhaps we could even get some tips about data governance from material asset management policies and practices around safe handling and security and disposal. So now let's take a look at financial assets. Financial assets, much like information assets, are representative in nature. That is, they represent something else. Financial assets at their core represented, accepted, portable value, pure and simple. And information assets themselves are reflective of activities of things, including, of course, financial transactions and financial assets themselves. So similar to material assets, we can and should borrow liberally from the age-old discipline of financial asset management. The concepts from financial asset management that stand out in comparison to material asset management include the concept of a portfolio or a collection of similar assets, or assets that are managed as a portfolio, not just individually. This will come into play when we discuss, you know, what levels of information granularity make the most sense when we're looking at valuation. Also, the concept of liquidity, the ability to convert financial assets into cash, is analogous to information accessibility. And financial assets that are less liquid carry more risk and therefore are discounted. Similarly, information assets that are less accessible because they're archived or compressed or offline are valued lower than others. So perhaps if we paid closer attention to the way money managers operate and the decisions they make regarding financial assets, we could apply some of those principles to information asset management. Then we have human capital management. We can learn a lot about enrichment and disposal. Human resource managers are consumed with ensuring that the right employees are hired and trained and evaluated and perhaps terminated when their value falls below, you know, what their cost is. Similarly, those managing information assets could be concerned with ensuring the right data is acquired, that it's enhanced, profiled, cleansed, disposed of when its value slips below its total cost of ownership. In addition, the way functional managers organize employees into higher functioning teams is a valid metaphor for how we organize and integrate data into higher functioning data sets or even data warehouses. I think that, you know, these concepts are all concepts that bear further exploration in the context of information asset management. So my recommendation would be that if you're a company that deals with physical assets, like a manufacturing, a retail, or a logistics company, then you should probably borrow and leverage ideas from your company's expertise in those areas, or leverage your existing methodology. Or if you're a financial services company, think about adapting ideas from the world of financial asset management. Or if you're with more of a services type organization, consider how to borrow some ideas from personnel management and organizational design for architecting improved data solutions. I think doing so will not only help improve your data strategy, but also align you better with the business and its existing vernacular. Remember, Words are important. Yet we as data professionals over the years, probably to our own detriment, have been inventing a new language, one that's been unfamiliar and uncomfortable to our business brethren. So it's time to kind of get more on board with them. Now, where can we go for these kinds of sources of inspiration? Even outside of physical asset and financial asset and human capital, even within the information realm, there are close neighbors, such as the specialties of IT asset management, IT service management, records management, content management, knowledge management, and even library science. Each of these fields includes standards and procedures worthy of consideration, certainly as we look to better manage information as an actual asset. For example, there's an entire family of ISO standards for ITAM, IT asset management. These processes and standards educate end users on compliance. They help budget managers make technology redeployment decisions. They provide IT service departments with guidance on warranty and other service information, procedures on invoice and IT asset inventory level information for finance departments. If you think about it, why couldn't or shouldn't these standards be adapted for information, not just technology? Or take records information management. RIM is a mysterious function for many of us within organizations that quietly goes about its business, preserving and safeguarding the organization's institutional memory. Often, RIM is part of a broader governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC function, under the auspices of the legal department, not IT. Although RIM's heredity and background is in moving about boxes of files and offices and storage facilities, the discipline actually has kept up with the times. It now includes the management of electronic records as well. Even with somewhat of a dated vernacular, RIM seems like an excellent framework for a set of data governance policies and procedures, doesn't it? In fact, I've actually seen an organization an energy company in the Texas area actually merge their RIM and information management initiatives really impressively. Or let's take a look at something like library science. The leading library science governing body is the International Federation of Library Associations, with formal guidelines on everything from the handling of storage media to content curation and sharing, overall library operations. No doubt many of these guidelines would prove instructive to chief data officers and other data professionals, even if they actually knew about them. Or let's get away from the world of other forms of IT standards to expand our exploration of asset management concepts in other areas. We talk about physical asset management. So just as with other IT information related standards and practices, we can learn a lot from standards like PAS 55. It's the basis for ISO 55001, which forces organizations to address 5 key questions. What assets do you have, right? An inventory. What is your risk of an asset related disaster? So we get into the areas of security and privacy. Do you know the current condition of your assets? Gets into quality. What are the costs of corrective versus preventative maintenance? And should you repair or replace any given assets? I think these are questions that every organization should also be able to answer about its information assets. So certainly the classic product service supply chain model is useful at a high level, and especially to express information management needs to those more familiar with physical supply chain concept. But I find the product and services oriented supply chain concept a bit too focused and on processes and a little less so on value creation if you look at them. So if Infonomics is a concept for treating information as an actual economic asset, a model or framework for describing its flow perhaps should center more on how each step increases the information's economic potential. So let's talk about that. So we can consider a range of different kinds of recognized assets, or the stuff that information manage. We've done that already, but this illustration simply shows how information's value potential leads to its realized enhanced value over a continuum. So we've broken this down into 3 different groupings: acquisition, administration, and application. Acquisition is how you get raw data or other information. Administration is how the data is enhanced, or what kind of machinery the information factory, as some call it, might include. And application is how information is received and used in generating value. Moreover, let me show you what these primitives actually look like here. So as one organization's information supply chain intersects with another's, or in the case of an information supply network, the arrow may actually loop back on itself. For example, sold, lent, or analyzed information may become the raw material or the raw data purchased or captured, or licensed or observed by other organizations and so forth. This is, again, reflective of information being a non-depleting, non-rivalrous asset. So I guess what I recommend is that before you start creating boxes and data stores and arrows endemic to a typical data architecture, perhaps step back and use these primitives to describe the flow and the complete life cycle of critical information assets, as if they were actual assets. So as I started to look across the range of asset management principles and practices, it occurred to me that there are a lot of commonalities among them, a lot of similarities and things that we probably could adapt as a basis for any kind of data strategy initiative. And so we've packaged them into a set of generally accepted information principles. And I'm going to run through them here a little bit quickly. So we've broken them down into 3: assumptions, constraints, and tenets, very similarly to GAP, if you're familiar with the generally accepted accounting principles. So we've kind of borrowed a framework from that domain. So the first one here on the assumptions is the asset assumption, which is that information is an asset because it meets all of the criteria of an asset. We've already talked about that. The proprietorship assumption says that an organization's information assets include all forms of data and content for which it can claim ownership or exclusive control. The appraisal assumption is that information has value, can be valued. Its value can be measured in terms of its realized value, its probable value based on our current capabilities, its potential value based on if we were applied it fully to any and all business processes where it was relevant. There's the dominion assumption, which states that the practice of internal information ownership limits its potential value to the organization and thereby the performance of the organization itself. So this gets to that notion of information owners, and we actually think that that's not a great idea. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then the benefit assumption says that information has uses well beyond its original purpose, and that should be capitalized on. However, there are certain constraints we need to recognize about information. One of them is that groupings of data or content that comprise an information asset are going to vary from one organization or use case to the next. So it's a little bit more slippery, perhaps, than other kinds of assets. There's also the recognition constraint that information obviously can't be represented in auditable financial statements, but there are some exceptions like purchased or acquired customer lists and content that may be copyrighted or patented in some situations. We also have the jurisdiction constraint that says that the provenance or lineage or ownership or sovereignty of an information asset may be difficult to determine or to legally establish, and we need to be aware of that and plan for that. The valuation constraint says that the valuation measurements of an information asset, very much like other kinds of assets, are going to be inexact, but they're going to be useful, just as valuations of other kinds of assets are. The resource constraint says that there are obviously trade-offs among information asset quality, availability, and accessibility, and that these are inevitable, and we need to plan and architect for those as well, and that our data strategy needs to consider those. Now, the tenets get more to the actual principles themselves, and so let's start with the relevance principle, which says that information assets should be managed with the same discipline as other recognized assets. It's not enough just to talk about information as an asset, but we really want to plan for managing it like another asset. The inventory principle says that information assets should be cataloged and described, and classified and related and tracked, again, just like other assets. The ownership principle says that by default, information assets belong to the organization, not to any application, department, or individual. We're trying to prevent that notion of information ownership, and that information should actually be not be hoarded and be recognized as an enterprise asset. Then there's the authorization principle, which suggests that the quality requirements, access, use, protection, and other rights and responsibilities for an information asset, even within the organization, should be contractually established by or sanctioned with an empowered trustee. Now, I like the term trustee to replace an owner. The term trustee carries the same kind of legal and ethical responsibilities of an owner, but not the baggage of the notion of hoarding or hoarding of information. We also have the possession principle here that states an information asset should be acquired or retained only if its actual or planned value is greater than its cumulative cost or as required by law or other regulations. This says, listen, if we store data, we should have an economically beneficial reason for doing so. Then there's the replicability principle, which states that an information asset should be duplicated or derived only to improve its utility or availability. And again, only if doing so increases its net value. We have to remember that every time we create a copy of data, whether we're moving it into a data warehouse or an operational data store or a data mart or a data lake, that every time we, or a spreadsheet, every time we create a copy of data, we're increasing our attack surface and the risks therein. We're increasing the risk that we're using data that is not synchronized with other data, and we're increasing our onus and the cost and the resources to actually keep that data synchronized. So we need to be more economically circumspect about doing so. And then finally, there's the optimization principle, which kind of gets to the division of labor among the business IT and information professionals or information department. That the business is responsible for optimizing the usage and understanding of information. The information management organization, even if that's part of IT, is responsible for optimizing information's availability and utility, and that IT is responsible for optimizing information's accessibility and protection. So that takes you through the 18 generally accepted information principles that we think should form the basis of really any kind of data strategy and be built on from there. All right. I'm going to skip those because I did talk about them. All right, and let's get to the maturity model. So, a solid data strategy approach starts with a vision for the possibilities of how information can add economic value. And whereas an information vision lays out what you want to accomplish, the information approach deals with the how. It provides more of a long-term or ongoing plan for realizing the information vision. Data and business leaders cite one or more of three components their organizations typically lack. One is a commitment from the enterprise, two is a roadmap of some sort, and third is a plan for organizational structures to really execute on the strategy. As we saw with the data strategy approach, with the data strategy approach, many of the challenges lead back to justifying funding and prioritizing information management. Many organizations haven't really successfully expressed the benefits and value of information management using measurements and a language and business terminology rather than just IT terms like satisfaction or data volume or velocity or variety, which are obviously important, but not measures of success. So deriving metrics that link the information management goals in alignment with established enterprise goals and measurements is really no easy task, but critical here. Next, of course, there's governance, decision rights and accountability for acquiring, valuing, creating, storing, using, archiving, deleting, et cetera. Information rarely are specified adequately. We think doing so would include frameworks and precepts such as principles and guidelines and policies, processes, standards, roles, and metrics that ensure information is going to help the enterprise actually achieve its goals. And ideally, these precepts align with well-established corporate governance concepts as well. So then there's the ability to establish specific roles, and organizational constructs, and that's critical to getting anything done in any kind of institutionalized and accountable way, especially when it comes to information. Otherwise, the IT organization is often forced to tackle information management as an off-budget or project-by-project initiative that lacks business backing or involvement. And yes, there are going to be reasons why you're going to want to do targeted kinds of solutions, but probably as part of an overall, or ideally as part of an overall data strategy. Then there's data architecture, which defines the data flows and processes in support of data governance precepts and establish business objectives. These lifecycle processes document and enable the flow of information from its creation or capture through to when it's ultimately archived or deleted. And then finally, we become concerned with the technologies that are used throughout the organization to capture, collect, or generate information, to integrate and transform data, to move, enable access to information like DBMSs, file systems, cloud storage, extract, ETL tools, data harvesting tools, profiling and cleansing, the data governance tools, master data management, and so forth. And of course, the variety of analytic technologies as well. So all these come together to define an overall information asset, information asset strategy. And of course, you can gauge your maturity on each of those as well, and we're happy to help you do so. So one of the other things that we looked at was these 6 R's of sustainability. We often talk about information ecosystems, and I think it's a great concept, and I dedicated quite a bit of the book to exploring this topic. You know, when an ecosystem is healthy, scientists say it's in balance or sustainable. And since we want our information ecosystems to be sustainable and thrive, let's take a look at how we might incorporate the principles of sustainability or conservation. Originally, known as the 3 R's of reduce, reuse, and recycle, folks have expanded them into 6 R's, which also include refuse, repurpose, and remove. There are various variations on it as well. So most information businesses are compiling information assets pretty furiously because they've either captured, they're easily captured or obtained, they're increasingly expensive to store, or they have nearly unlimited data monetization potential. This makes sense, but as gigabytes become terabytes and terabytes become petabytes and petabytes become exabytes, the sustainability of an information ecosystem or architecture or infrastructure can be threatened. So let's talk through each one kind of quickly here. So refuse. Refusing an asset is the surest way to prevent any expenses or risks associated with it. Why capture or collect information you have if you have no intention to leverage it? Doing so incurs excess storage costs, unnecessary costs up and down the information lifecycle, such as planning and design and architecture and data integration and so forth. And collecting more unneeded data can impact operational analytic and business performance. So sometimes refusing an asset involves rethinking and reinventing our consumption habits and processes for information altogether. Certainly refusing information can be a difficult decision because especially in this age of untold opportunities for data monetization and decreasing storage costs, but in many cases, data you don't collect today will be licensable from a partner or a data broker when you need it tomorrow. Let's talk about reducing. So reducing an asset is about minimizing rather than eliminating, and it involves the expenses associated with it. So data architects and data modelers have struggled with this kind of conundrum daily since the introduction of the relational database. How do you balance things like performance versus storage? Similarly, app architects like CRM and ERP and other application architects wrangle with decisions over whether to include or exclude certain fields from the application's data model. How many different kinds of addresses do we need for a business customer? Or do we have to capture point and sale terminal number tags for each sale in addition to the cashier's employee ID? Or other related storage questions like what level of granularity or detail should electronic media be saved? Too often business users involved in design are going to say, yeah, just capture it and then we'll decide if or how we're going to use it. I think data architects need to have the ability and authority to push back a bit on that. So then there's reusing. Reusing an asset is simply, to use it again for the same purpose or whatever that purpose is. Unfortunately, such as the nature of information, it's non-depletable. We can use it again and again, no matter how much we use it. And as we discussed earlier, this is one of the characteristics that makes information highly monetizable. You can't eat or sell the same sandwich or pizza more than once, but you can license and consume that same customer contact data over and over again. Other assets like automobiles, they depreciate over time, so reuse may not be a primary consideration in information ecosystems design as much as reusability is a key characteristic of information. But if you find certain information isn't being reused, such as in the case of dark data, it may be time to think about how to reduce it or repurpose it. So let's get to repurposing. Repurposing an asset involves sharing it and enabling it to be used for different reasons. For example, an Uber or Lyft driver's automobile is a prime example. It's used for both taxiing, for taxi and personal reasons. So repurposing any asset, including an information asset, can lower or spread its net cost of ownership across multiple entities. And it can generate additional benefits that offset its initial expense. Just as information's non-depletability enables its extreme reuse, information's, remember that characteristic of non-rivalry, enables its extreme repurposing. We can use it multiple ways for multiple purposes. So clever information data and enterprise architects recently have been honing their skills at identifying opportunities for repurposing information. It's some of the work that I've done with a major airline manufacturer. Yet, I still find that most organizations have only scratched the surface, lacking kind of the creativity or the will or just the awareness that certain information assets even exist in other parts of the organization or elsewhere. Back to the issues of data ownership that typically lead to data hoarding. These also tend to interfere with information repurposing. Then we have information recycling. So recycling is the process of breaking down an asset to create a new one. With transactional or other kind of structured information, portions of a data asset can be parsed or recombined to create new data assets. If the original data set remains in use, then this is more likely reflective of reuse than recycling. In any case, architects should look for opportunities to do so rather than discarding the information altogether. Often recycling is going to involve sharing kind of decomposed information, if we go back to the information ecosystem concept. Sharing that information with others, even outside the organization, so that they can benefit from creating new kinds of data assets from it. For example, I'm recycling here bits and pieces of my research in my book for this webinar, and I'm actually teaching a class on an MBA class on Infonomics. Finally, we have the removal. So the removal or dumping of physical assets is a last resort, but with non-physical or intangible assets, removing unneeded ones is easy and doesn't really harm your or anyone else's ecosystem. But it can help with lessening the costs related to personnel or storage or processing. For example, purging a customer database of old records with dead email addresses or actually dead customers, as some of our clients discover they have, is one simple example of this. All right, so let's move on to roles. With these new and adapted ways of defining your data strategy, inevitably new roles are going to be required beyond traditional data management roles that we've been staffing. So let's take a look at some of these new roles. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the role of the data scientist and the chief data officer and data engineers and so forth, but these are some additional roles that might make sense in the context of managing information as an actual asset. All right. So, not every role needs to be a full-time job. Some of these are maybe formalized or incorporated into existing jobs, depending on your commitment to each function and your ability to affect the cultural and the organizational change needed to kind of raise the information's prominence as a true asset. Technological advances have always led to new kinds of roles, and I'm not talking about the proliferation, if some of you have seen some of these roles of hackneyed role modifiers like ninja or rock star or prophet, or there's a guy who calls himself the Lord of Dark Data or Sensei or Alchemist, are kind of some funny qualifiers that we've seen. I'm not talking about those, as fun as they may be. So let's talk about the data curator. So the data curator or librarian or wrangler, this is somebody who specifically is responsible for identifying the wide range of potentially available information assets outside the organization and for evaluating their utility. But then you need somebody to actually license them. So this is where a commercial data procurement manager comes in. This is an individual tasked with licensing the external commercial information assets, such as those from data brokers or business partners. And sometimes this procurement function, I've actually seen this in some organizations, is actually part of the traditional procurement function as well. Sometimes it's still in the IT organization or elsewhere in the business. Then we have social media content specialists. Individuals knowledgeable about the range of social media content available, skilled at getting access to it programmatically or via social media content providers to help supplement your organization's data and analytic capabilities. So then we have roles more about, back up a sec, sorry. There we go. Then we have roles like the information trustee. So this is a role, again, replaces the data owner designation, which has really perpetuated the tendency toward, like I said, data silos and data hoarding in organizations. Information trustee should be somebody who formally further formalizes the responsibilities and accountabilities for a given information asset. Then, because of the importance, increasing importance of data regulations and emergence of data regulations such as GDPR and the California Privacy Act, a lot of organizations need somebody who can advise on the growing range of laws and regulations and how they impact data and analytic initiatives, both current and planned ones. Maybe we need a data compliance engineer. This is somebody who's dedicated to or available to perform compliance-related functions on data assets. These include, but certainly not limited to, expunging personal data to comply with right to be forgotten regulations, or implementing encryption or redaction or masking or anonymization schemes, creating safe extracts for data scientists. And then we might need a data quality assurance manager, somebody who will establish and lead an enterprise data quality function and team at the point where we're actually formalizing data quality in the organization. Okay. And then there's some other interesting roles in the architecture function that we're starting to see. Somebody like an ontology specialist, or whatever you want to call it. This is somebody who's dedicated to the disciplines of classifying and relating data, defining taxonomies, semantic webs, knowledge graphs, and linguistic modeling, all terms that you don't want to mention in front of business people, but yet are increasingly critical to manage information as an actual asset. So we might have a data type expert as well, somebody who's an expert on particular emerging and unique types of data, like IoT data or blockchain or multimedia or social media or geolocation or weather data. It's great to have folks who are experts on those as well. Okay. Or yeah, so I think I covered most of those. Let's move on. So just to wrap up here, we've taken a brief look at how to understand information's unique characteristics, how to adapt asset management ideas from other areas of the business, and what basic, what a basic set of data strategy principles should include, and also some thoughts on new, emerging, and anticipated roles for the organization. So I hope this session has given you some additional food for thought about how to elevate your own organization's data strategy. And of course, I look forward to hearing from you and discussing how we at Caserta might support your data and analytic efforts. So I think we're going to turn it back over to questions. I think Remy is handling those. Here's a little information on how to reach me. And a suggestion, stay tuned for some future webcasts on this. We're just kind of touching the iceberg here, tip of the iceberg on Infonomics, and we'll certainly be having future presentations on strategy-related topics, architecture, and of course, technology-related topics as well. Remy, I'll turn it back over to you to address any questions that might have been submitted.
All right, thank you, Doug, for the excellent presentation. And again, if anyone would like to ask a question, it is in the questions panel on the right of your console. So let's jump into it. Our first question is for Doug. It seems that a large part of the value of leveraging data is the opportunity value. Conversely, opportunity cost, if not leverage. In order to value data properly, does finance or accounting need better methods for calculating opportunity cost versus value?
I love whoever asked that question, because that gets to one of those cornerstones of Infonomics, which is that information actually has value. And just like any other kind of asset, that value can be broken down into realized value, what that asset is currently generating, its probable value based on your current your current capabilities to generate value from an information asset. And then there's this kind of way to look at the potential value of information if you were to generate, if you were to use that information asset in any and all ways possible. And so yes, many organizations have done these measurements. They've used some of the valuation models that we've compiled in collaboration with valuation experts and clients to do so. But who in the organization is going to do this? I think it's a great idea to actually connect with your CFO and say, have the conversation like this. Here's how it will go. Listen, Mr. and Miss CFO, I understand information is not a balance sheet asset, but in order for us to become a more data-driven, information-savvy organization, we need to start behaving as if it is one. And will you help me established some methods for quantifying information's potential, versus realized value, to help make improved decisions about where we should invest in data strategy and information management and technology and resources, and better establish a vision for what's the art of the possible with information. It's hard to do that if we're not measuring it. And where I've heard those conversations have taken place, the CFOs are very open to those kind of conversations, particularly in this information age. It may not always go well, and it may take a little bit of a push to get there, but there have been some really incredible examples of companies who have started to measure the value of their information, leading to hundreds of millions of dollars of unleashing untapped value in information assets. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Doug. The next one is master data management still at the heart of any successful data organization model?
Data, I don't know about the heart of it. It certainly is in there. It's one of the organs. I don't know about the heart, but it's hard to master data management. It's hard to inventory your assets, or it's hard to integrate information assets if you don't have solid master data management. So I would say definitely yes. And we're talking, of course, about product master data management and customer master data management as being kind of the main two core components for that. There's some great emerging technologies for this and some emerging practices to improve that. Getting back to valuation, it's very difficult to value things like master data or reference data, but they should really be part of an overall data strategy. If not the heart, certainly one of the other organs. Thanks, good question.
All right, our next question is, retail companies are investing in third-party tools to dynamically assess CLV and personalize offers, services accordingly. But the third-party algorithms are often proprietary, and retailers don't know how much customer data is being valued. Are there any case studies of how third-party AI, ML tools are showing their clients who provide the data how the algorithm is actually valuing the data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one ought to be very circumspect about third-party algorithms that are proprietary and use proprietary data, particularly if they don't really make good use of your own data or a broad swath of external data like harvested web content or open data or syndicated data or social media data. As far as valuing that, as far as examples go, yes, we have hundreds of examples of companies that are using external data and internal algorithms for doing things in the retail world and elsewhere. I think on a subsequent webinar we should share some of those and go through an example of those, but can't do it here in the next few minutes.
All right, that's definitely a topic for a future webinar we'll keep in mind.
Yeah.
Our next question is, how do you balance offensive versus defensive use of data? One, to monetize, or two, to ensure compliance? How would you do that?
Yeah, that's another great question. Probably something I should have touched on in the session. It's a topic that I know Tom Davenport, for those of you who know him, has been talking and writing about. I think he has a great article in Harvard Business Review on that. Also Tom Redman. And so the idea here is that CDOs in particular, and just your overall data strategy, should balance offense and defense. And by that, we mean offense meaning finding ways to generate benefits from information, and defense ensuring that information is the way that you're handling information is compliant. Now, over the last couple of years, chief data officers have been very focused on the defense side, on compliance, as these global compliance regulations have taken shape, like GDPR and the California Privacy Act. But I just don't think that a chief data officer is going to be successful unless they find a way to actually balance data monetization and or generating data value and compliance. So yeah, there's not much more to say other than that balance is important and needs to be an equal focus of any data strategy. Thanks, good question.
Great question. And we have time for two more questions.
Great.
Let's start with, how much are self-service BI and self-service data prep, data flow in organizations? That's maybe there was something missing from that one. Let me try to see if the
Well, I
presentation.
could probably address that
I think
just in
that went
general.
apart.
So we actually see the kind of the bifurcation of analytics in organizations, moving maybe somewhat away from kind of traditional reporting environments. Most CIOs and executives I talk to are desperately trying to get out of the report writing business. And the way that they're doing that is by, on one hand, enabling self-service analytics, getting the business people to become more comfortable with, for kind of the fairly easy to use analytic tools. But part of that really needs to be around data literacy. And we didn't talk much about that in this session, but getting the organization to understand what data exists, ought to be part of a data strategy. What are the limitations of that data? What are examples of the ways to use that data? Before you ever train them on the tool, I think a lot of self-service analytic initiatives forget that part and jump right to tool training, and that's a big mistake. And then the other part of that bifurcation is moving more toward advanced analytics and doing more of that prescriptive and just diagnostic and predictive part of the analytics. That's really the domain of data scientists. So I wouldn't focus exclusively on self-service analytics without also balancing that with a team of folks that can handle the more robust, kind of crunchy questions.
Excellent. And our last question is,
Sure.
what part of data strategy do you find most organizations overlook or falter at the most?
Wow. Well, I think they jump right into the approach and roadmap and thing, and they forget about vision. What do they want? How do they want information to be perceived throughout the organization? What is the culture, the information related culture components of an organization? And I wouldn't skip over those before you start getting into the nuts and bolts of how you're going to architect your data and what the roles and such will be. I think getting the business people and executives involved in establishing that vision for how do we, what does being data driven mean to our organization? What does being digital mean to our organization? And defining that first before you create a roadmap or any kind of detailed processes.
Wonderful. Doug, thank you again for the insightful presentation. Everyone, thank
Thanks.
you for attending today. And I encourage you to reach out to us with any questions you may have on this topic or anything else that Caserta can help with.